Very good day. Uh, Today we are going to talk about postmodernism with a reference to Paul Courtney's text, which is narrative. And in the postmodernism, we are not referring to postmodernism as for postmodernism, but the elements that are used in postmodernism, like the techniques such as fragmentation, pastiche, or histoire, discourse, and rupturing effect. So these are the aspects which we are mainly focusing on in this particular context, which is postmodernism. With a reference to Paul Cobley's text, which is narrative, we are referring to the term narrative used here, according to Cobley, the term narrative used here as a keyword to understand the term postmodernism. It is also important to understand that the main purpose of writing this chapter, postmodernism, is to introduce these narrative techniques to the readers. So this chapter is also significant because this chapter analyzed two different texts like John Fowles, the French Lieutenant's Woman, and also Italo Calvino's If on a Winter's Night Traveler. So these two texts were referred in this particular context. So Cobley's perspective with a reference to these texts and all these details were explained in detail in Postmodernism. So postmodernism is actually a broad movement that developed in the mid or the late 20th century. Um, it developed in various fields such as philosophy, arts, architecture, literature, even in the literary theory as well. So all this shows a deviation or a drift away from the traditional pattern of modernism. I suppose modernism is after modernism, so it actually shows that how the postmodernist writers are different from the modernist writers. So the main perspective here is that in the postmodernism, it aims to subvert the expectations of most of the writers of the time, and you can find it is actually a mixture or a blend of different genres fused together to give a narrative structure to the elements. Even in the case of literature, even in architecture, you can find two different genres combined together, and that gives the structure to what postmodernism is. So this is what most important highlight of this particular period. Even in the text which we are going to refer with reference to Paul Cobley's perspective, which is John Fowles and Italo Calvino. These two texts also talks about the story, but it how these techniques are fused into it. Fused in the sense it is in the form of characters or through the narration or through structures or through by ways of certain techniques like pastiche is used or we can say fragmentation, even globalized so consumer materials. So these kind of aspects are there to show uh, how postmodernism differs from modernist writers. Uh, First, let's understand what is this Italo Calvino's perspective about. Because in this text, the author used this new element of writing or new style of writing to show how it is break or how it is far uh, moved away from the traditional pattern of writing. So in this case, you can also find elements like pastiche, fragmentation. So you can find all these elements which just now I have mentioned. You can find all this in If on a Winter's Night. A traveler written by Italo Calvino. In this text, all these techniques are used here to show that this is an adventurous piece of writing, but also a drift away from the modernist perspectives. But the most interesting thing is that though it has different elements like pastiche, fragmentation, and all these techniques are used in between the text to add beauty to the text, but it gives us a complete and a finished story. But the story has so much of gaps and which needs to be filled, and which is filled with the use of these techniques, and thus leads to the finished completion of this particular story. The most important aspect, one of the most highlighted aspect of this particular text is also that the characters, or you can find different stories are fused together. Though it's a finished story, as we mentioned, but different stories are fused into, like there are certain characters like Madame Mem and Ludmilla. So these characters were given a separate space in the text itself. Like the characters occupy their own space, and even how the transformation of their character also highlighted through different chapters or different narrations in this particular text. So you can find this different stories. For example, how Ludmilla lost his identity, and how Ludmilla gained her identity towards the end of the story. So this losing one's identity is also given importance, and how that person gained the identity is also given. So these are all separate stories that combine together. Also, even Madame Mame also occupied an important perspective in this. So even her characteristics also occupy. So it creates a kind of confusion to those readers who are reading the text, who feel a sort of confusion between the characters and the personality. And the main purpose of this modernist writers is to create a confusion, a suspense, an element of suspense in the mind of the readers. Even for this, they are using the terms like or the techniques like pastiche. Pastiche is a technique which gives a globalized perspective or in of certain aspects to writing. Like here in this text, you can find the Russian Revolution, the condition of Russian Revolution. Even also, you can find Japanese writings. Also mentioned here. Even the protagonist is given an Indian perspective, like the Indian protagonist named Nacho. So this way, it's a fusion of different cultures and different globalized perspectives fused together in the form of the technique called the pastiche. So these are all postmodern elements actually. All these are in a way it's a postmodern elements. So all the purpose of all this postmodern element is to show how the text moves from a certain instance to another, and how the story has the element to capture the attention of the readers. So this was what we were discussing in the last classes, like then digression, detours, and the suspense, all these elements, signs and symbols. So all these elements are used in a narration. But since we are in focusing on the postmodern perspective, how in the postmodern perspective in literature, how what all elements were used, like the cliché, rupturing effect is one such element. So we are going to, in this particular section, we are going to talk about the rupturing effect. How this rupturing effect is used in the in a postmodernist text, and this is what we are going to explore through the text like written, sorry, through the stories written or the novels written by John Fowles and Italo Calvino. So for this, I'm going to refer to this text, which is Paul Coble's narrative, and in this the text, this particular chapter start itself with John Fowles' novel, The French Lieutenant's Woman, which was published in 1969, but deals mainly with story events that took place in the year 1867. So you can find 2 years of fused in this, like the present is 1969 and the past is 1867. So you can find these elements of Victorianism, you can find these elements of modernism in this particular text. So how the author is, narrator, or how the writer is going to demarcate this deviation between the past and present. That's what we are going to see. At one point in the narrative, the heroine, Sarah Woodruff, returns to her room and unpacks some goods she has bought. The sequence is narrated as follows. So in the text, there is a beautiful section is given here to show. Even you can find the description shows lot of the Victorian artifacts mentioned here. But at the same time, this deviation, or we can say the digression, is created by with the introduction of the narrator to show that this is not happening in the present, it is happening in the past. So this deviation or this separation of years genres you can find here. Slowly and carefully she lifted out one after the other a row of wrapped objects and placed them on the green cloth. Then she put the basket on the floor and started to unwrap her purchases. So this is in third person narration. Okay, so be very careful. So suddenly, this paragraph starts with the third person narration, and slowly you can find the narration moves from third person to the first person narration, and this is where you can find the gap between the past and the present. That's why it's a beautiful narration. She began with a Stafford teapot with a pretty colored transfer of a cottage by a stream and a pair of lovers. She looked closely at the lovers and then a tawny jug, not one of those garish colored monstrosities of Victorian manufacture, but a delicate little thing in pale mauve and primrose yellow. Jollyman's features charmingly lacquered by a soft blue gaze in brackets. Ceramic expert may recognize a Ralph Lauren. Those two purchases had cost Sarah ninepence in an old china shop. The toby was cracked, and was to become re-cracked in the course of time, as I can testify. So here you can find I can testify. So suddenly it was all in third person, and suddenly again it moved back to, or moves to the towards the first person narration, as I can testify. So the past Toby, the jar was already cracked, and now it becomes re-cracked in the course of time in the coming years, as I can testify. Having, so here you can find the presence of a narrator who is narrating that, as I can testify that it re-cracked in the course of time. So the presence of the present, pulling the readers from the past and pushing them towards the present. So this is what you can clearly see in this context. Having bought it myself a year or two ago for a good deal more than the 3 pennies, Sarah was. So previously it was mentioned Sarah bought it for 9 pence. So now you can find it is at present, this particular Toby jar is charged for 3 pennies. But unlike her, I fell for the Ralph Lauren part of it. She fell for the smile. So this way, very clearly and beautifully, this separation between the ages, and also even the Victorian and the postmodern, and also you can find the element of past and present, third person and the first person, even to the artifacts also you can see how old it is. So these way, that clarification or that distinction between the time and space is clearly marked here. What is clear about this passage is that part of the narration exists as a very conventional third person, as I mentioned, past tense, and a realist account telling what Sarah did in a manner that would not be alien to a history book and would seem fitting for a novel written just over 100 years after the period that it depicts. Yet another part of the narration consists of an almost unseemly interruption of the events by the narrator, who offers first-hand narration about one of Sarah's artifacts and its present-day condition. Before analyzing this passage further, it is worth saying that the narrator's comments constitute a typical example of the rupturing effect. So this leads to our main point, which is the rupturing effect. So this episode, session, we are going to talk mainly about the rupturing effect, right? How it is used in a postmodernist text. So this leads all these elements like the past and the present, the narrator in first person and third person narration, and also the architectural descriptions. All this clearly takes us to a separation between within the text itself, and this is what we call it the rupturing effect. And this is an element used by the postmodernists to separate the past to the present and also create a spacing between time. Let's just talk about rupturing effect. What is this rupturing effect means? This rupturing effect is actually a term that was used by Tom Gunning to describe the way in which in the early films, if you find this terms were like rupturing effect was used mainly in films in cinema. The main purpose is that actually because when the performance was going on and the audience was completely moved by the act of the actors and the story and the plot, uh, to actually create a interruption in their performance and to directly address the matter to the camera and to the audience. The term rupturing effect is used as a visual effect or a kind of cinematic spectator here. So in this process, you can find the performance between the performers. They reminded us that you are watching a movie. It's not something which is real. It just pulls you from the reality to the present situation. So it's actually a construction. It also takes you to a particular vantage point, and then with the help of this rupturing effect, it can take you or pulls you forward to the uh, you know pulls forward towards time, so the present time. So this is a technique used here. So these are all actually, we can call them, instead of techniques, we can say these are all narrative levels used by the postmodernist writers. Like as I mentioned, rupturing effect, even we have pastiche, fragmentation, historia, discourse. So these are all different narrative levels. The Hutchinson actually described this rupturing effect as something that subverts the conventional pattern of narration, because here also you can find it's not completely the 19th or the 18th century narration, right? It talks about the Victorian descriptions through the character and also through the artifacts. But this description of the narrator, it actually subverts the conventional narration of narrative pattern. So this is one important way that this rupture here through the narrator's um, creation or the narrator's role in the text. So the rupture effect in fiction consists of a narrating agency that reveals itself. So, but we can find everywhere the subversion is happening. Either it can be in the form of an implied reader or implied author, or it can be through the narrator or through a narrative. So through all these means, you can find how the structuring effect is explained in the text. When we come back to this particular text, which is Paul Coble's narrative, Paul Coble, why he uses why he is referring to these terms like the rupturing effect in this context, especially with reference to Paul's, the French lieutenant's woman. The main purpose is that he wanted to show how in this text this conventional third person narration got ruptured by the use of first person narration. So it actually breaks and subverts the conventional course of narration, right? So that is one important one which we can see. It also shows the indifference of a narrator who is very conscious of novels' fictitious nature. It actually pulls us to the reality. That means the previous narration was completely in the past, and now it's the present day condition and the present day narration. So you can find that deviation between the past and the present in this condition. Also, with a reference to the other one, which is Italo Calvino's, in that novel, actually, you can find how the narrator comments on reading the main narrative and subverts. So you can find there are different stories combined together because each story about each characters. So all these are fused together to give a finished story. Also, you can also find that in this particular text, you can also see um, the elements of different elements from different countries that also fused here to give a globalized effect. So these are certain techniques used by the postmodern writers. But along with it, there is another term which is very significant in this context, which is metafiction. So that also is important in this context because metafiction is as a term. It actually talks about the fiction, but it is not fiction against fiction. It is fiction about fiction, or something beyond the concept of description. Right? Metafiction as a term, it draws the attention to the levels of narrative which exist behind or outside the main narration. But the term metafiction was not actually used before 1970. This was first coined by William Gass, which uh, around the year 1960. So, but he is not referring here to the anti-novel or the anti-fiction here. What he mainly, the main intention of using this metafiction is to think uh, beyond what is already set in the fiction. That means uh, think you have to interpret it or behind or outside the text. So that is actually the main purpose of using this metafiction. So for Coble, an entire body of narration is characterized by rupturing, which can also be a term to define metafiction. So the designation used here, you can also find this term is not talking or not explaining the term fiction against fiction, as in anti-novel or anti-fiction. It's not that what it means by metafiction. Metafiction is something which pulls you or makes you think beyond and uh, things after or behind. So these are certain meanings of this term meta, which means why. But why we are explaining all this in this context? We are defining all this in the context in reference to Patricia Walk, which Cobley has referred here in this context. So let me read that particular section from the text. I'm not going into all these details. Just focus on this Patricia Walk's argument, Patricia Walk argues that increased awareness of meta levels of discourse and experience is partly a consequence of increased social and cultural self consciousness. Beyond this, however, it also reflects a greater awareness within contemporary culture of the function of language in constructing and maintaining our sense of everyday reality. The simple notion that language passively reflects a coherent, meaningful, and objective world is no longer tenable. Language is an independent, self contained system which generates its own meaning. Meta therefore, or meta terms, therefore, are required in order to explore the relationship between this arbitrary linguistic system and the world to which it apparently refers. So, what she's talking about in this particular context, she's arguing that the language for the modernist, the language is something which is very dependent and which is meaningful in its existence, and also it cannot be defined without the reference to the text. But in metafiction, it is a level beyond than that. That means the language itself occupies an independent identity of itself, and even the meaning also has an independent existence. And so it is important to go beyond the textual reading and understand the context and interpret it. So this actually explores a relationship between the arbitrary linguistic system and also the world to which it refers, or we can say the reality. So, this is what she is arguing here, because you are the language is not something which is within the context itself. It can be defined with relation to other perspectives as well. So it, because it has an independent identity of itself and a meaning as it is, so it is important to refer to it with reference to the everyday reality. So this is what Patricia Waugh talks about, and Paul Gobley is referring to it in this particular context. So she also used this particular reference with a reference to John Fowle's text, which is the French Lieutenant's Woman, which was published in 1969. This actually describes as upsetting a particular convention of the novel. Of the novel, she actually used, or she actually referred to three different texts here in this context. One, the French Lieutenant's Woman, and another one is Mandisa, which was published in 1982, and Trout Fishing in America, which was published in 1967. So she refers to these three texts and conclude that how these works attempt to create a linguistic structure um, by encouraging the reader to draw his or her knowledge, which is completely with relation to the traditional literary conventions, but also with relation to the present realities. So this way, a combination of tradition and also the present day realities. So this is what Patricia Waugh tries to argue through this in this particular context. So yeah, all these texts actually, for example, the French Lieutenant's Woman, all this text talks about the convention, but how the convention can takes you forward to the next level of reading, or that's what we call the narrative level of reading, and which creates a relationship between the arbitrary linguistic system and also the reality which is surrounding. So these are certain elements which we need to understand. Also, she is of the opinion that this um, kind of narrative levels can be developed in different by different means. Like one, like um, the use of sexual act as a metaphor can be in that way. You can also create a differentiation. Also, you can also use the dictative tones that can serve as a model for readers' activity. So this way also you can create all this allegorical plot devices. Another method which she mentioned is that actually the game structures that represents the fictional system. So these are certain ways, according to Patricia Waugh, these are certain references that divides metafiction according to the use of the allegorical plot devices. So, but in this particular text, Patricia Waugh's perspective is borrowed by Paul Cobley to explain how this rupturing effect can be used and applied in and is applied in the postmodern context. So this is the main aspect of this particular discussion. So I hope it is clear. And in the also there are references to Umberto Eco and all, but this time being we just stop here and we'll explain all this in the coming classes.